Hi, I'm Famine. Okay, welcome to the bonus edition of The Stream. Now that this show is on Al Jazeera every day, we're virtually family. Thanks for tuning in. Coming up, the ugly side of the Olympics, and then we head to Lebanon to hear from survivors of the Beirut port blast on the first anniversary of the tragedy. Let's start up here. How's your brain doing? Ever feel like it's reached maximum capacity? There are some researchers who believe that our brains are about as developed as they are ever going to be, and we have to rethink how we think. The premise was the start of a fascinating discussion inspired by Annie Murphy Paul's new book, The Extended Mind, The Power of Thinking Outside the Brain. Now, I needed help to navigate the conversation, so we brought in neuroscientist Gina Poe, Professor of Psychology Dominic Packer, and of course, science writer Annie Murphy Paul. Here she is explaining what inspired her to write her latest book.
Well, so I have two sons who are school age, and I got very interested in how they learn in the science of learning. And in my research and reporting on the science of learning, I started to notice a bunch of different fields that were all looking at how these outside the brain resources factor into our thinking. And then I happened to come across a journal article by two philosophers that proposed this idea of the extended mind, which is the idea that we don't just think with our brains alone. We actually extend our thinking processes out into the world with our bodies, with spaces, with other people. And that, to me, tied together a lot of the research findings that I was finding so interesting.
Part of your research, you discovered Peter Reiner. Go ahead, Gina, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I see, Annie, that you are talking with your hands, which is part of recommendations of your book. So yeah. I have started adopting that too. Even though we're seated here, we're not taking a walk, which would be even better. At least we are using our bodies. And what that does to our brain is it puts it in a mode where we can learn better, actually. We learn best through teaching, and then when we're teaching, if we're active, we are learning even better. Our brain is in the state called the theta state, which is about 5 to 10 waves per second that occur in our hippocampus, which is our rapid learning structure in our brain, associative learning. So when we put things together, and when we move, our hippocampus goes into the theta state, which is really best for learning.
So the example of a smartphone, we now all carry them around and increasingly use them not just to make phone calls and also keep track of dates, but for taking photographs. And the more we walk around the world and take photographs, the more we are potentially outsourcing the memories of things that we've seen and events we've experienced. And there's actually research now on the effects it can have on your memory for events. Say you're touring a museum and you see art, and as you walk around, instead of simply looking at the art, you take photographs of the art, and especially your favorite pieces, how that affects your memory then for that event. And what you find is that if people are using a phone or a camera generally to record the event, they're in some ways outsourcing the memory and the experience of the event, and it changes the way they remember. It changes the way they can later on recollect what they saw. And the reason it does so, at least in part, is because as you take those photos, you're paying attention to the situation in a different way. So by using that technology and outsourcing the memory, you're also potentially outsourcing a part of the experience and thus affecting what it's like in the moment and then what you experience later on.
I have lots of YouTube questions for you, guests. I'm going to get you to answer them pretty quickly if you can. Annie, some people are not getting quite what brain capacity means. Is it possible to run out of brain space?
Well, you brought on Peter Reiner, who just gave that very interesting example a minute ago. And it was Peter who introduced me to the idea that the biological brain, it may be running at full capacity at this point, meaning we are using every bit of our brains to deal with our really complicated modern world. And that the only way to transcend the limits of the biological brain, which evolved to do very different things from what we ask it to do in our modern world of symbols and abstract ideas. The only way to transcend those limits is to bring in these external resources, like the body, like spaces, like other people. To offer an example of my own, there's interesting phenomenon known as transactive memory, which refers to the fact that in a group, you can share memory such that each individual has access to the memory of all the people in the group. Nobody can know everything, but everybody in a group can have their own specialty. And when you know what other people know, you have access to what they know as well.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, Annie, how when you talk and recollect an event with your friends, they might have a very different recollection of something than you do. And that act of recollecting together helps you bring up that memory and then incorporate all of your friends' recollections into your memory. And then when you reconsolidate that memory, which occurs while you sleep that next night, you reconsolidate their memories in with your own. And hopefully, as a group, you all will remember more accurately than any one memory.
Justin wants to know, Gina, what causes forgetfulness and how can he avoid it?
Well, forgetfulness occurs if, first of all, you didn't have all systems working in the first place when you were trying to remember. For example, you weren't paying enough attention. So a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine in your brain helps you remember things in the first place. And acetylcholine comes online when your brain is in that theta state that I talked about before. And when we are actively attending to something. Another thing that helps us remember better in the first place is to tag a memory with another neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. And that's something we're researching in my laboratory right now. What does norepinephrine do to help us tag our memories so that we consolidate them well while we sleep and then don't forget them later?
I love that show. I felt so much smarter after hosting it. Now, after the live episode, I asked the guests to share one practical suggestion for how we can all start thinking outside our brain.
Well, Femi, I'm thinking of that picture of your office still, and we didn't focus in on what your actual desk space looks like, but I'm wondering if you have items that remind you of important things in your life, important people, because research suggests that cues of identity, things that remind you of who you are or who your best self is, and also cues of belonging, like cues that remind you that you belong to a meaningful group. Those can really support you, give you confidence, give you a sense of rootedness. And even if just for a moment you can look away from your screen and look at these tokens or these pictures that remind you of who you are and what you're doing there and what your goals and your values are, that can be a really great way of using space to extend your mind.
Personalize space, make it mean something. Gina.
Yes, I would say do what we did on this show, which is talk to experts around you. You don't always have to move. In fact, some people can't move, but that doesn't mean their brain is going to be any more limited if they can imagine moving. Your brain does the same thing, actually. And the other thing is take a nap after you've learned something hard. I think that office space of yours should have some cots in it, because a nap is as good as a whole night's sleep for consolidating the things that we've learned.
Who knew I was doing neuroscience by taking a nap? I love it.
Yeah.
Dominic.
I hardly endorse the nap idea. And I think one of the reasons why people might feel that their brains are at capacity in the current moment is we now live in a world, especially given social media, of this onslaught of information from all around the world, right? Potentially millions of people can feed each other bits of information, and some of it's true and a lot of it is false. There's misinformation and disinformation, and how do you tell the difference? And in this environment, it can feel extremely overwhelming. And I think one of the things to note is that throughout history, as humans have developed new technologies, people have felt like that over and over again, right? So if we think about the invention of the automobile, at the beginning, only rich people have cars, and it's not really a problem. But eventually, they spread throughout populations, and it became incredibly dangerous on the road, right? People died in automobile accidents all the time. Over time, as groups, we figure out how to cope with that. Car makers get better at designing cars. People learn how to drive better. We create driving lessons and at exams. The government creates regulatory agencies to force automakers to be more safe, and so on. And in some ways, we can think about our information environment in that kind of way. This technology is so new, it's like we don't know how to handle it, and it really is overwhelming. It's taxing our capacities. But over time, we'll build institutions and we'll figure out ways, like we did for the car, of handling it better.
From science to sport, and a controversial movement that's gaining momentum. As viewers, we see the extraordinary achievements of Olympic athletes and para-athletes, but there is a dark side of the Olympics that are some activists proposing that they be abolished. On YouTube, the stream's audience was pretty much equally split between loving the games and thinking that they are a colossal waste of money. After the live broadcast, I asked the guests to tell me one shocking fact about the games that fans of the Olympics probably don't know.
Well, I think the games contract that comes as the kind of the devil's bargain that cities engage with the IOC in order to negotiate these hosting privileges is pretty shocking. There's a lot of legal permissions there that are just absolutely unseemly and seem, I know this word gets used way too often these days, but like Orwellian in terms of scope and scale, especially like in Japan. We saw that polling in the population there, there were a lot of concerns about COVID. Overwhelmingly, people wanted to cancel those games. And if you look in the fine print in those games agreements, it's not just as easy as the local government listening to the commands of their people. And even now in LA, we see that our city council is setting up a new games agreement that calls into coordination a bunch of federal agencies that you wouldn't necessarily think would be given almost extraneous, like impossible powers here in Los Angeles, like ICE and all sorts of other government entities that aren't very popular here in Los Angeles, but they're already coordinating on a securities detail for the 2026 World Cup and the 2028 World Games. And it's awful.
They've talked about this is the most gender equitable game ever because now women are 49% of its participants. But the executive board for the games, women made just 7 out of 35 seats less than 6 months ago before the head of the games resigned after saying women were too emotional. And that's why they shouldn't really be in the room. Every time you see a package or a commercial from them about a Paralympian, right? Remember that Becca Myers was denied by the USOC, backed by the IOC in this decision to bring her mother as her personal care assistant with the reasoning that there was already a single PCA for 33 Paralympians, 10 who are visually impaired. Every time you hear the Olympics pat themselves on the back for creating a youth sports center or turning the Tokyo Olympic Village into equitable housing, think about those displacement numbers. Think about how if you're going back to Atlanta, right, a mere 7% of the families displaced from one of the housing areas ever got anywhere close to moving back into the neighborhood. Literally for almost everything that you can see them packaging and romanticizing. COVID, last year, you remember the Olympic official said the flames of the Olympic torch were going to extinguish COVID. And now watch how they're making the numbers grow in Tokyo right now. That gap between their romantic view of themselves that they're saying, right, for profit, and what's really happening in terms of abuse, of harm, of athlete exploitation, that gap is the mess, is the mark, is the real story of the Olympic Games.
Oh, that's given me pause. Jules.
Yeah, I mean, just jumping off of what Dr. Davis said, the IOC should not be confused with some sort of proto-feminist organization. They did not allow members that were women until 1981, so the Reagan era, okay? Even today, around a third of their members or so are women. They could obviously do better. But my shocking fact, I think, would be the fact that there's a study from the Oxford University that found that every single Olympics for which there is reliable data going back to 1960 busted its budget. In other words, it's what I call etch-a-sketch economics, whereas during the bid phase, you say the games are only going to cost so many dollars, and then in reality, they cost so many more dollars. It's not just an Athens thing. It's not just a Rio thing. It's an Olympic thing. And it's in every single games. And people that are thinking about the Olympics moving forward should be fully aware of that.
That right there, a reality check on what goes on behind the scenes of the Olympic Games. This week, the stream marked the anniversary of the Beirut port blast. 1 year after the deadly explosion that killed more than 200 people and injured thousands of others, the official investigation has barely started. After the broadcast, the guests were very clear about what needed to happen next.
Moving forward, we are calling for a United Nations investigation. We do not have faith in the Lebanese domestic investigation. We're calling for that to happen now. It can go before the United Nations Human Rights Council when they sit in September. There are competing demands, political crisis, economic crisis in Lebanon, but the victims that we represent want justice. Justice means many different things to many different people. It can mean criminal prosecution, it can mean compensation, it can mean finding the truth, and that is what they want, and that is what they deserve, and that's why we're fighting with Murray. And it's been so hard for the victims come forward, but we need to support that, and that's what we are pushing for, and we brought a report out today on that issue.
What would be the most practical way forward from the survivors' perspective, from families of people who perished in the Beirut blast? If you were going to say, OK, this is pragmatic, this is what we need to do, what advice would you give? The international community is watching, I know politicians in Lebanon are watching. What would you say?
I would say first that immunities should be lifted. I don't know why we're still talking about immunities after 1 year, after all these damages, all these lives and people whose life were totally destroyed. And second, I will call for the international community to step in and to help us with an international independent investigation so that we can achieve the justice we're looking for. Because, I mean, in Lebanon, given the track record and what's happening so far, Judge Bitar alone, I don't think he can face all the, all the pressures and all the immunities and all the, those who are trying to hide the truth are very strong in Lebanon.
Thank you to the families of the victims and survivors of the Beirut blast who contributed to the stream. To find out more about Beirut's search for answers, watch the full report with correspondent Zaina Hodder, now streaming at aljazeera.com. And finally, I want to leave you with an urgent issue that really isn't getting enough attention. In southern Madagascar, almost 500,000 people are on the brink of famine, all because of climate change creating endless droughts, making farming impossible. There is no food. People are eating insects. After the broadcast, I asked our guests to make a pitch to the international community to get them to help the people of Madagascar.
So there are two parts to this, Femi. I think it's saving lives now. We have 500,000 children who are at the risk of dying if we do nothing. Femi, I think we need to bring that to the front and emphasize that strongly. We're talking of 500,000 children. Action Against Hunger, we're only able to reach about 30%. Capability to do more, but there's no funding. What is the value of a life that is already lost? So we need to make sure we're clear about that and talk more about that. And then begin to talk about what we need to do when the child survives. What are we going to do to make sure the child can then be able to fed well so that he or she can live up to the potential that he or she has been given?
Shelley, it's not every day that we get a chance to talk about the work of the World Food Programme in southern Madagascar. What do we need to know to get people to act? Because without the world helping, those pictures that we saw of children suffering, they're going to get worse.
The horror is drastic, you know, when you're seeing children who are just skin and bones and elderly people. And it's our job to support the government and the people of Madagascar, the youth, the women, so that in the short term, it's about getting food, it's about being able to make sure that nobody goes hungry. There's an expression in Malagasy, kere, empty stomach, and people will say to you time after time after time in the South, empty stomach, that's not acceptable. Having money means that we can, number one, get food to people. Number two, we need to build long-term programs. So when we talk about drought, let's find the solutions. Let's build better infrastructure, water irrigation, harvesting, think about innovation, think about what it means. We don't want to have this conversation, Feni, in 12 months' time. Mm-hmm. We don't want to be in the same situation where the numbers are getting drastically larger, children are losing their childhood, and basically, the hope for people of Madagascar needs to be a lot more positive and can be more positive with the support of people just digging a bit deeper, giving some money, making sure that we have the resources to really save lives.
So let me ask the awkward question. I'm going to do it because this is really important. We're going to be very candid with each other. I want to bring in Hanta Rinoro. And Hanta Rinoro talks about where we are with the hunger situation in southern Madagascar. And sometimes it can be quite confusing. If we're on the brink of famine, why is there food in the shops? This is what she addresses. Have a look, have a listen.
What I've seen in the south of Madagascar is that there is food on food stalls in markets. However, most people cannot afford that food because they do not have any money. They usually get their income from farming, cattle breeding, from charcoal selling, and basically traditional, very low income sources. So I think that what the government has to do is that they have to make sure that those people have enough income to be resilient through the drought.
So Charles, Shelley, how do we have an entire half-an-hour conversation without mentioning the government of Madagascar? Were you treading lightly? Charles, you go first.
The government has a huge role to play. After all, they oversee the entire country. And in this case, the reason why the name haven't shown up more because it's not a typical situation where the economic system in the country has collapsed, right? And it's not conflict within it. And this is where we are linking to the climate change, which is bigger than even the government. But they have a role to play. So it's about us working with the government to look at examples where it has worked. There are many improved livelihoods in this area.
You're off topic. I wanted to put the pressure point on the government of Madagascar. If your people are suffering, what is the government doing? Shelley, I know this is very awkward for you, but I'm asking anyway. Go ahead.
So I was with David Beasley. I was with him down in the south on that mission, and we were with the Minister of Water and Agriculture, and they are absolutely committed. No doubt about it in terms of what needs to get done, but you need money, right? You need money these are not cheap projects to do, and these are long-term projects. We also work with the government of Madagascar on amazing school feeding products, but we don't have school feeding programs, but we don't have enough money to scale that up. And I'm sorry to go back to it, but the money is essential in terms of funding and resources. Mm-hmm. And to the lady that just spoke in the clip, unfortunately and sadly, when you do see food that's out there on perhaps a small mat, people who are walking 4 kilometers to get water, selling their utensils just to be able to buy whatever edibles they can. They may not even have the firewood still. And COVID, unfortunately, has just affected the entire world. As well as Madagascar. So jobs are scarce, livelihood is scarce, food prices are rising. It's such a sad reality, but I think, if we can just pick up some of that absolute, genuine, sincere hope for helping people in Madagascar, I think we can make a difference.
Can we make a difference? I hope so. And that is our show for today. Thanks for watching. See you next time.